Thanks for coming today. I first met our speaker today, Thomas Goltz, in Bonn in Germany, and traveled with him for a couple of weeks through Germany and Belgium and Poland. And in the course of many conversations there, I stitched together a few small parts of the fascinating personal story of a man who seems to split his time between the netherworld of post-Soviet Union, Turkey, and Livingston, Montana. I'd known a little bit of his earlier work, a book called Azerbaijan Diary, and then I'd read a hilarious indictment of a school for elk hunters run by some huckster outdoorsmen in Montana. But I also knew all this time that there was a book out there that Thomas had been working on about his experiences in Chechnya during the first and second, mostly the first Chechen war in the 1990s. And when he told me earlier this fall that book had in fact been finished and was going to be out in October, I jumped at the chance to bring him out here to talk about it. Chechnya Diary is a remarkable book about some remarkable people, the Chechens, who at various points in the book live in Georgia, Ingushetia, Kazakhstan, and sometimes even in Chechnya. The book takes seriously the proposition that when we observe events, our very act of observation often changes the outcome of these events. The book does not spare detail, and it does not spare the author itself, who it now gives me great pleasure to introduce, Thomas Goltz.
Time, I wasted time, and now doth time waste me. Yes, indeed, the glasses. Well, may as well start with a bang. And the first thing is, if you carry these, please turn them off. I just turned off mine. Walk slowly and just say da whenever I ask you anything. Got it? Da, I said. Isa, my guide and companion for the last 2 hours, looked at me and chuckled. Are you scared already? He asked. Da, I replied truthfully. But in fact, I'm only following your instructions. Isa's cheeks jiggled and his large belly heaved as he suppressed a chuckle. Heh, 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 he tittered, trying to hold his breath. It was actually not such a good joke, and hardly the opportune moment to enjoy it, even if it had been. We were halfway up the Baku-Rostov highway to the Zalota Most, or Golden Bridge, which we were going to cross illegally on our way to Chechnya at war. I was numb from a mixture of cold, fear, and several sleepless nights, thinking about what I was about to do, but was determined to do anyway. It was February 1995. And the bridge represented the sole border post on the Azerbaijani-Russian frontier, and it was a bundle of contradictions. For starters, it had been officially closed a month before, when Moscow accused Baku of turning a blind eye to Chechen fighters and their supporters crossing on their way to Chechnya. And yet the bridge remained unofficially open. One reason was the fact that while the frontier in question was internationally recognized as that delineating the boundaries of the Republic of Azerbaijan and the Russian Federation, that particular part of the Russian Federation was Dagestan, a sort of sub-republic or mini-state populated by a crazy quilt of mainly non-Russian and almost exclusively Muslim ethnicities, including many Chechens and many Azerbaijanis. Their views about the Russian-Chechen conflict were quite different from those held by Boris Yeltsin and his advisors. While the latter thought it the most obvious place to intercept men and munitions on their way to Chechnya, the former were determined to keep the bridge open as an artery of supply. Actually, the real reason the officially closed bridge and border remained unofficially opened was more basic than the call of ethnic or religious solidarity. It had to do with hard, cold cash. How are you feeling? whispered Isa, when our communal taxi pulled off at the roadside shrine to Saint Khizr, the Muslim patron saint of sailors, travelers, and lost causes. It was the first time, for security purposes, that we had spoken since leaving Baku. Normalno, I replied, shivering in the damp Caspian winter chill. I'm okay. Don't worry, hissed Isa. We have it wired. The name says it all. Zalota Most, the Golden Bridge. What do you mean? I asked. We call it that because everyone who works there gets rich, Isa explained. Now give me some cash so I can buy us through. I slipped him a couple of $100 in smaller bills. Isa took one and stuffed it into the contribution box outside Khizr's shrine and looked on approvingly when I made my own pious donation. Then we walked back to our communal taxi and drove the next hour in silence, not speaking until we entered no man's land. My disguise, a 2-month beard trimmed to Muslim style that was gray enough to make me a respected elder, a greatcoat covering the 30-pound flak jacket I was wearing, and a lamb's wool Astrakhan-style papach atop my head, seemed to be working. Coupled with my front seat position, it had sufficed to keep our 2 other traveling companions' curiosity in check, thanks to the local code of silence in front of elders, who must speak before being spoken to. I had kept strict radio silence until now, but now Isa was breaking it. Dr. Temur, he said in Russian from the back seat, using my nom de guerre. We have just crossed the Zalota Most over the Samur River. Is it good to be back home? Da, I said on cue. Suddenly, a white Jiguli sedan darted out of the darkness and blocked our path. What? Cried our driver, and mutterings of concern from the 2 other passengers ricocheted around the car. Don't worry, friends, it's for us, hissed Isa, trying to reassure them. Then he turned to me. Get out, now! But my bags, I said. Go, barked Isa. Your stuff will rejoin you on the other side of the frontier. Just go! Things were moving too fast. I was out of one car and into the other, and a man sitting in the passenger seat turned to me to say hello, revealing double rows of gold-capped teeth in so doing. It was soon clear how he paid his dentist. Dengue, he commanded. Money. Isa forked over a small wad of $20 bills. It's not enough, screeched the man after making a quick count. What do you mean? Said Isa. You said $100. Each, said the man in the passenger seat. The price of transportation has just risen. This is a scandal, growled Isa. That is the border, said the driver. The choice is yours. Look, guys, Isa implored the pair. We are really low on dough. Let's make it an extra 50 and call it even. The driver and man in the passenger seat exchanged glances. For the Muslim cause, boys, growled the driver, took the extra cash. Then he turned on the ignition and hit the accelerator, screeching to a halt in front of the security gate. Dr. Temur, Isa asked in a loud voice as we emerged from the car, do you have a cigarette? Da, I replied, and gave him one. Remember what I told you, growled Isa, bending close as if to get a light. Just answer yes to everything that sounds like a question. These Russian dogs would sell their sisters, their mothers. Do you understand? Da, I said. The station was bathed in a cheesy, incandescent light, illuminating a knot of Russian soldiers standing near the barrier while others clambered like ants over a truck, making an inspection. Invisible dogs barked. A searchlight swung across an adjacent field. Then we started walking toward the barrier. That little section is the first chapter of my book on Chechnya at War, entitled Chechnya Diary, a war correspondent's story of surviving the war in Chechnya. I mention the title right now, and especially the subtitle, because subtitles are so important for readers of understanding what a book is all about. I famously, or infamously, delivered my manuscript to my publisher 700 days late. I didn't have any more chips on the table, and they imposed this subtitle, and indeed the title, on me. My subtitle would have been something like The Story of a Massacre and Its Aftermath, and putting the emphasis not on the vessel, me, telling the story, but rather on the event itself. The book attempts to detail not the entire war currently raging in Chechnya to this day, in one of the most awful places on earth, Rather than going to the macro picture, it is a microcosmic view, a worm's view, if you will, of what occurred within this tiny Muslim principality in the Russian North Caucasus, beginning in 1994 and before, and what has led us to the state we are in today in Chechnya, where Chechnya is one of the most blighted places in the world, and indeed blighted to the point where it's difficult to imagine how much worse it could get. Specifically, I found myself, through Isa, my companion, holed up in a tiny little town, 10,000 people in the North Chechen plain called Samashki. In the Chechen language, which is quite different than the Russian language, it means the place of deer. For the first 3 days that I was in Samashki, on assignment, what I thought was ABC Nightline News, to put together a piece on the Chechen spirit of what motivated these people, this tiny group of people, to fight like heroes over sacred land against overwhelming odds. For the first 3 days, I was actually angry. I thought I was in the wrong place. Here, rather than being under fire in the capital city with all of my colleagues, getting bombed and getting interviews with all the major players, General Johar Dudayev or the redoubtable Shamil Basayev, the most wanted man in Russia, here I was in a tiny little community of 10,000 people, basically consisting of farmers, blacksmiths, or electricians, people just attempting to go about their lives, who were not motivated either by any sense of Islamic fundamentalism or even rabid nationalism. And on day 3, I said, self, there is no wrong place to be. And in fact, you have found yourself in the right place. You are in the Chechen equivalent of Grover's Corners. Recall the Thornton Wilder play, Our Town. A normal place to the point of being normal, to the point of being boring. And I said, this is where I will go to work. So I began meeting various people in the town, the potato farmers, the blacksmiths, the electricians, and the commander, a gentleman by the name of Hussein, who came from the Chechen diaspora in Kazakhstan, and we'll go to why this is important presently. And he'd come back basically to set up an ideal farm for himself and his family, only to find himself forced into the position of being a commander of this tiny little garrison and hoping that the Russian soldiers would just bypass the town. Well, to roll the ball forward, the Russians decided not to bypass the town, but rather come through on a vodka run. The locals reacted to this, basically stopped a drunken column of Russian soldiers on tanks and APCs, and upped the ante, and things began swirling out of control until finally Samashki was surrounded, with myself in it at the time, and the Russian command decided to make an example of what would happen to any little Chechen community that decided to resist overwhelming firepower. Negotiations were held that my friend Hussein participated in. The town was officially demilitarized under the most incredible threats. And after the men with guns, the defenders of the town, went off into the surrounding forests, the Russians came in and basically obliterated the town anyway. It was the my lie of the first round of the Chechen War and the creation of a name, Samashki, that was designed to send terror to all other Chechen communities that chose to resist. I made a film about this, not for ABC Nightline. That's an involved story of how the American news networks choose what is news and what is not. But it was eventually brought to the PBS networks via a interesting television company in New York called Global Vision, who had a program at the time called Rights and Wrongs, Human Rights Television. If you did not see this film in the summer of 1996, you're to be forgiven. It was one of the most obscure programs that I've ever heard about. It ran in New York City, for example, at 3 o'clock on Sunday morning. It ran at LA at 5 o'clock at Tuesday morning. I saw myself speaking in Spanish, interestingly enough, in Seattle at noon on a Saturday because the local PBS Spanish language network had decided to pick up on this particular film. I was actually going to show you a clip of this thing today, but the original thing was not going into your system back here. But I will, if we have time, show you what happened after that. The film was nominated for an award called the Rory Peck Award, named after a friend of mine, a astoundingly brave or foolishly brave British cameraman who worked Afghanistan, elsewhere, and the lands of the former Soviet Union, who was then shot and killed in Moscow on October 3rd, 1993, and as a result has an award named after him, the Rory Peck Award. It's one of the biggest freelance awards that one can get for independent camera work in the world. I was nominated for this. Happily, I did not win because all of those who were nominated and went through the vetting procedure and became finalists basically were there for having proven themselves to have been absolutely insane to have shot the material that had brought them there. And the suggestion of the prize was that you would win the prize and go off and do something even more insane than the project, with the result that many of the Rory Peck Award winners are no longer with us. But the BBC thought that I should have won. And Nick Gowing, a name in international television more respected than Tom Brokaw, Peter Jennings, and Dan Rather all rolled into one, came up to me at the end of the ceremony and said, "We thought you should have won, and we're willing to put our money where our mouth is. I'm going to give you the assignment of a lifetime. I'm going to send you back to your town, Samashki in Chechnya. You're going to do an aftermath story, because we journalists so seldom go back to the coalface. We so seldom go back to the killing grounds. We go in and wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. We extract our interviews, we make our stories, we enhance our careers, and then we move on to the next war or the next crisis or the next country or the next event. We don't take responsibility for our very presence in places of crisis." So I agreed to go back as the BBC correspondent to do an aftermath on the war. It was an extraordinarily delicate time. The Chechen rebels had managed to de facto make themselves independent from the Russian Federation in 1996, and immediately took a long dive into filth and chaos, where Chechnya became a byword of kidnapping, murder, ransom takings. The most horrible event at that period of time was the killing in their sleep of 6 Red Cross workers by their guards, allegedly, because they had refused to up their salaries, to another equally nasty thing where 5 British telecom workers in country trying to set up a cellular telephone network for the Chechens were abducted. The ransom was not paid. The anti-kidnapping squad was closing in, and so the kidnappers killed the 5 Brits and decapitated them and left their heads lying alongside of a road. It was not a fun environment to move back into in Chechnya at that time. Even less fun was what happened when I got back to Samashki. I expected to be received with open arms, a prodigal son returned or something like this, but this was not the case. I'll leave what happened there up to the video, which we'll show presently. Chechnya, Chechnya, Chechnya. Book on Chechnya. Mine is not the only one, thank goodness. Mine is a deeply personal account, and I recommend that you buy it. But it's not the first. The first good work in English to emerge from this period of time of sadness and sorrow was written by 2 colleagues of mine, Carlotta Gall and Thomas de Waal. It's entitled Chechnya, A Small Victorious War. This is the British publication title. The American is Chechnya, Calamity in the Caucasus. Once again, we get back to the subject of how important are subtitles. Calamity in the Caucasus might have a nice ring about it for us, but it really doesn't say anything, because a small victorious war is an allusion to the phrase used by Boris Yeltsin's Minister of Defense, Pavel Grachev, who, as Russia was spinning out of control in 1993 and 1994, basically said, how do we fix the situation and get the population back on our side? Let us conduct a small victorious war against the most disliked and indeed hated people within the Russian Federation, namely the citizens of the Republic of Chechnya. So a small victorious war has resonance far beyond Calamity in the Caucasus, and indeed this may be the fulcrum statement of why this war began at all. A small little operation to distract public opinion from Boris Yeltsin's various excesses that had nothing to do with the war itself. Another book, which, and I'll put these up here so you can take a look at them later and take on the titles if you'd like, is by another colleague of mine, Anatol Lieven. He was the Times of London correspondent in Moscow throughout the 90s, and he's now with the Carnegie Foundation in D.C., a brilliant writer and analyst. And in this book, Chechnya, Tombstone of Russian Power, you get 5 books in one. Rather than it being Chechnya-specific, it is a comparative study of independence movements and the quest for self-determination from everywhere from Southeast Asia to the Berber Mountains of North Africa. Why self-determination and independence struggles sometimes work and why they fail. 5 books in one. I recommend it very, very highly. Another book by another colleague who was deeply impacted by the situation in Chechnya is that odd title. I don't know if it was his or was his publisher's, but To Catch a Tatar, Notes from the Caucasus, by the Agence France-Presse correspondent in the region throughout the 90s, a gentleman by the name of Chris Bird. Chris Bird is no longer a journalist. He was so disgusted by what he saw and wrote about in Chechnya that at age 35 he threw in the towel and returned to the United Kingdom and began to study medicine. He is now Dr. Chris Bird. He intends to volunteer to various crisis zones around the world where he feels he can be much more useful as a man of medicine than just being a mere hack. For those of you who prefer to have your history sugar-coated as fiction, there is no better book than this by David Cornwell, a.k.a. John le Carré. You remember him, of course, of Tinker, Tailor, Soldier, Spy, The Man Who Came In From the Cold, The Little Drummer Girl, most recently The Tailor of Panama. This is a book that came out in 1995, very, very presciently, just as the war was breaking out. In other words, he had written it before, so 92, 93. It is called Our Game. And what it is basically is an exploration of institutional responsibility to one's subject, not journalistic so much as that of MI6 and the CIA and various other institutions that attempted to manipulate the little peoples of the Soviet Union in order to weaken the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, well, these little people were left to fight among themselves in these various ethnic wars, which were often the direct or indirect result of outside manipulation. Our Game, John le Carré, those of us you who want to read it, just one little note. Whenever he uses the word Chechen, he means Ingush. Whenever he uses the word Ingush, he means Chechen. The Ingush are the cousins of the Chechens as part of the Vainakh nation, one of these groups of people who has always lived in the Caucasus Mountains of the region in between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, and indeed the people who may be legitimately referred to as the original Caucasians, even no matter what the Russians say about them today, using the most racist terms. On that note, I'd like to give you just a very, very quick overview of ethnic and national development in the Soviet space and its predecessor, the Tsarist Russia. I find it useful, especially with American audiences, to make some sort of parallel between the experience of the native communities in North America and indeed South America, Native Americans, Indians, and the experience of the indigenous peoples of the Caucasus region, because it's exactly the same period of time, the early and then mid-19th century, that the American forces are pushing west and encountering, either through Lewis and Clark in friendly ways or less friendly encounters, that of Custer and the Little Bighorn, for example, the indigenous population of the West. At the exact same period of time, Tsarist forces are pursuing their land empire by pushing south into the Caucasus regions, displacing previous overlords, the Ottoman Empire, the Persian Empire at the time, and piecemeal absorbing or sending to flight or exterminating the little, mainly Muslim groups of this region. And in fact, it's notable that the word Chechen itself is not a Chechen word. The Chechens refer to themselves as Nokhchi, and the Ingush refer to themselves as Galgai. Both of these words are merely the names of the first two villages, Chechen for the Chechens and Ingush for the Ingush, that Russian forces encountered as they were pushing their way south. One of the great, if you will, to go along with the American Indian paradigm, either Chief Joseph or Sitting Bull of the region, was a gentleman by the name of Imam Shamil, who was the great resistance leader against Russian encroachments throughout the 19th century. Famously led a 50-year resistance until he was captured in 1852 or 1854, brought to St. Petersburg, put in the golden cage, as it were, that is a prisoner of distinction, attended Tsarist weddings, things like this, and eventually was allowed to make pilgrimage and went to Mecca and Medina in today's Saudi Arabia, died and was buried there. The interesting thing for me, as a scholar looking at ethnic and national development, is that Imam Shamil was not even a Chechen. He is claimed today as the greatest Chechen leader of the 19th century, but in fact, he was an Avar, one of the other many little Muslim groups of the region. And I would submit to you, and we don't have a lot of time to go into all of these details, I would submit to you that throughout the 19th century, there was no Chechen national consciousness at all, but rather a religious consciousness. That a Chechen or an Ingush or an Avar or a Lezgi was primarily a Muslim first, and that national consciousness only arose, and with that national consciousness, a sense of territoriality in the early 20th century, and specifically with the Russian Revolution. The Chechens and the various other Muslim groups of the region sided with the Reds against the Whites. Well, one very good reason for that, of course, it was the Whites who represented Tsarist power, and Tsarist power was that power that had been attempting to crush and assimilate them in the 19th century. Parallel to Woodrow Wilson's declaration of his doctrine of self-determination and the 14 points following World War I, Vladimir Lenin also had his doctrine, although from a socialist communist perspective, of national self-determination. Some have read into this, and certainly into its implementation by Stalin, as a salami tactic device to divide and rule all the little peoples who made up the Russian space and then the Soviet space. There's an interesting book out that don't have on my table here that I bring your attention to. It's by Professor Terry Martin at Harvard University, that goes in the face of this long-standing assumption that Stalin was the breaker of nations and that this was all some grand charade to divide and rule. His book is called The Affirmative Action Empire. And it's a completely different read on the Soviet space, which makes fascinating reading of how this was indeed policy, how every individual within the Soviet space was to select an ethnicity, cling to it, while at the same time assimilating themselves into that larger whole called Homo Sovieticus, much like the modern American. And if we look at the Soviet Union in comparison to the United States, there are many distinctions of policy, this, that, and the other thing. But it is, if the American ideal was the melting pot, where from our various immigrant forefathers we would eventually assimilate into some monolithic whole called the American, in the Soviet Union you might call it the icebox at play. Everyone was to cleave to this ethnic/national identity and make the Soviet Union stronger as a result. Well, this is not the way things played out, and indeed ethnic policy within the Soviet space ranged from highs to lows. Under Lenin, I believe it was something like 250 recognized ethnic national identities. Lenin died. Stalin declared himself uninterested in the ethnic question, and the number of ethnicities plunged to something like 76. Stalin died in 1953. New ethnic entities were either revitalized, restored, or created until finally, at the time of its collapse in 1991, the Soviet Union officially recognized 126 discrete ethnic national identities living in 55 discrete and recognized territorial entities, ranging from the 15 so-called titular republics, the Soviet Socialist Republic of Azerbaijan, Soviet Socialist Republic of Uzbekistan, Soviet Socialist Republic of Estonia, down to a whole range and indeed plethora of smaller territorial entities that had to do with some sort of ethnicity, such as the Chechen Ingush Autonomous Republic within the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic within the USSR. Back to the Chechens. The Chechens were subjected to this territorialization, starting in 1922 with the first Soviet constitution, where they found themselves to be part of the so-called and short-lived Mountain People's Soviet Socialist Republic within the Russian Federation. We don't have time to go through all the permutations of how this began, but the territorial idea of a Chechnya kept on changing with time and indeed kept on being enlarged with time. Up until 1944, where the Chechens, along with a number of other Muslim peoples of the region, were accused by Stalin, very conveniently, of having collaborated with the Nazis as the German Wehrmacht or army attempted to take over Baku and the Caucasus and the oil fields there. They failed. They never got down to Azerbaijan per se, and indeed only got within 100 miles of the Chechen capital, Grozny. But on the evening of February 23rd, 1944, Stalin sent in his henchman, Lavrentiy Beria, the head of the NKVD, which was the precursor of the KGB, which is the precursor of today's FSB in the Russian Federation, and using Studebaker trucks sent to the region as part of the Lend-Lease program of the United States helping the Soviet Union against the Nazi foe, basically diverted all of these trucks from the front down to Grozny and into the mountains of the North Caucasus, and picked up literally every last Chechen, put them on the trucks, brought them to the railway station at Grozny, shoved them onto the railway cars, and expelled them to the frozen wastelands of Central Asia at winter. Siberia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. Half died en route. This is called in Russian, and indeed one of the loan words in Chechen, the whistle, or the deportations. And it is the moment that is marked in every Chechen's mind. In 1953, Stalin dies. Beria attempts to take control of the Soviet Union. Beria has his dreams put paid to with a bullet in the back of his head. Nikita Khrushchev comes to power, and in 1957, Khrushchev decides, as part of the de-Stalinization campaign within the Soviet Union, to restore the Chechens as a people who had become a non-people, erased from Soviet history books, and indeed the borders of the Chechen English Autonomous Republic had also been erased. That's 1957. The Chechens begin to creep back. And this is one of the most extraordinary moments I find in Soviet history, with virtually no documentation for it. Once again, to evoke an American example, it is as if the Seminole Indians living in Oklahoma, having been sent from Florida down the Trail of Tears, suddenly decided to up and go back to Florida, confronting the reality that their lands and their houses are occupied by others, and decide to start camping there and to reassert control over their territory. Now, the extraordinary thing is that this is the Soviet Union. This is not the place where people have freedom of movement like this. And this is one of the most abused peoples within the Soviet Union, with no money, with no passports, internal or external, basically picking up their bags, hitchhiking, getting on buses, trains, and getting all the way back 3,000 kilometers from Central Asia to the Caucasus, with virtually not one trace of information being written about this extraordinary event. Once again, the Seminoles decide to return to Florida, and neither Fox News nor CNN nor the New York Times nor any academics ever bother to write about this extraordinary event. Well, that's what they did. In 1957, the Chechens returned to Chechnya, but they returned a territorial people and a people with a chip on their shoulder who were attempting to go toward independence. That moment came with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, where Chechnya, along with a number of other of these ethnic entities, declared sovereignty, perhaps not even knowing what that word meant. Do we know what that word means? Is sovereignty independence? Is independence independence from what greater whole? But in 1991, independence was declared, or sovereignty rather, and things began to snowball into the conflict we have at hand. I would like to read one quick other little chunk of the book, and then I would say that we'd have time for the video and then a little bit of question and answer, but I understand that I've got to stop by 1 o'clock sharp. And I'm trying to pack in a lot of information into this one little hour. Samashki. First meeting with Hussein. It has to do with the return. beg your pardon. Cocks crowed. Turkeys gobbled. Dogs barked. Brothers snored. And then a heavy diesel truck engine roared. A horn sounded, a sustained blast, and a now familiar voice shouted from beyond the courtyard's metal door. Michao, Tomps! Ah, Tsigao! It was Hussein, my new friend and, I guess, partner or guide, taking advantage of some lull in the action, or non-action, come to collect me for a little tour of outlying districts he thought I should see. I held off long enough to get a cup of coffee down my non-Muslim hatch. It was the holy Muslim month of Ramadan, but I'm not quite sure what to say about coffee in this context. A cup of coffee down my non-Muslim hatch, grab my camera kit, and pull myself up in the cab of Hussein's rig, a 4-ton Kamaz truck painted military green. Tomps! Shouted Hussein over the motor roar. Remember that power station and mill I told you about yesterday? I didn't, but said I did. We are going there now, shouted my host while releasing the clutch. We soon were bouncing down a deeply pitted road beyond the bridge and checkpoint, on the way to Achkoy Martan. The truck had such bad suspension that the frequent blows to my head could kill me if a Russian attack helicopter didn't blast us first. There was no guarantee that the latter would not happen. The Russian forces made a bit of a game out of arbitrarily blasting cars and trucks on all Chechen roads, and Hussein's 4-ton machine certainly looked like a target of opportunity to me. Actually, we were no longer on a road, but a twin path of tread marks leading through sparse trees. Were we in that wild garlic forest that was bombed daily, or some other grove? Had a decision been taken to dispatch this overcurious observer, me, who now knew too much about Samashki, or what? Who was Hussein? What was I doing here? How long can you live with casual paranoia before it kills you? Another downshift through a puddle, maybe a creek, that splashed dirty water on the shattered windshield of the Kamaz. A left, a right, another left beneath more trees with branches scratching against metal and glass in a way I would not let trees touch up my beat-up old Ford in Montana. Then we stopped by a big pit, both the sides and interior overgrown with weeds. When I came back from Kazakhstan, I was looking for property around here, said Hussein, climbing down from the driver's side. I had heard about this place. Lovely ground, trees, water to build a small mill. My mind was set. Then this is what I found. I jumped out of the truck and fiddled with my camera kit, testing the microphone and attaching the tripod. Look, said a voice in the headset that was coming from nowhere in sight. It was Hussein, already deep inside the unnatural pit, clambering down the far side, feeling, touching, tenderly fondling pieces of rough masonry extending at flat angles far down below. Flagstones, natural building blocks. Then I got it. The flagstones were actually tombstones, Chechen tombstones, used as an easy quarry after Hussein's ancestors were bundled off to Central Asia in February 1944. Vidish, breathed Hussein, back up on level ground after having bounded out of the pit, and solemnly, lovingly stroking a new stack of cut stone that passed as a regular wall leading to a sluice gate. Vidish, do you see? The perfect farm, a place replete with a miniature hydraulic plant and pond, was built using the gravestones of his ancestors. I remember when we first came back, we kids would sneak out to this place. It was already in ruins. Maybe it was never completed, recalled Hussein. And there was a metal wheel associated with the generator. Ah, here it is. And we would spin the wheel and get it going as fast as we could and then dare each other to take a leap and seize the edge and spin. Hussein spun the groaning metal wheel, and I recall doing a similar stunt in grade school back home, trying to impress chicks. Yes, we were kids, breathed Hussein. How could we know we were playing on the graves of our forefathers, laughing? And I remembered this place. And when I came back, I had my mind set on owning it, developing it, because the remarkable thing was that no one else seemed to want it. So then I came back, and with my heart filled with dreams and memories, and someone had to explain why no Chechen farmer could ever homestead here. And that is when I began to understand, really understand Tomsk. There is no difference in time or space between the Tsar's cannons against Shamil in 1854, the Bolsheviks seducing us to fight against the whites in 1918, or Stalin deporting us in 1944, or Yeltsin rolling his tanks over our tombstones today. Every 50 years, Tomsk, the Russians attempt to eradicate us, because we have never submitted, and we never will. We dumped the truck back at headquarters and proceeded on foot on another round of visits to some slit trenches and machine gun nests on the north side of town, and then ambled over to the Samashki cemetery. Look around. Look, Tomsk. This is the cemetery of our elders, our brothers and sons, said Hussein, picking up a piece of tombstone broken off by a random Russian bullet and placing it atop a marker. The last time Ivan attempted to destroy us, back in 1944, he took every last stone to build that mill I just showed you, grave robbing from this solemn place in order to erase all memory that we ever lived here. Tsing, tsing. And then the retort of a gun somewhere in the hills west of town. We were getting sniped at in the cemetery. I instinctively ducked behind a larger tombstone, but not Hussein. He marched on, seemingly oblivious to the danger. Then I finally caught up with him. He was finishing the Muslim creed of faith, the Fatiha, and wiping his hands over his face. Here is the Chechen spirit, he quietly breathed. I looked at the hand-painted name on the simple tombstone. The birth and death dates suggested it belonged to a 10-year-old who had died almost exactly 2 years before. My son, said Hussein, without further explanation. It is why we are here. We will not let Ivan plow under the graves of our people ever again. Then I noticed the day and month of birth. Hussein's son had been born on the day of mourning on which Chechens commemorate their day of genocide, February 23rd, 1944. He had never been allowed to celebrate a single birthday. Well, before we run out of time and to have something for the Q&A, I'll just dodge and say that this is the basis of the Samashki story, which you get the aftermath of now if we can hit the thing, if they can see me back there. And let's hit the lights. Samashki. The word in Chechen means the place of deer. To me, it meant the horror of war. The place is indelibly carved on my memory. I was inside a killing zone and have never been so frightened in my life. I was there as the farm town was turned into the symbol of Russian brutality when Moscow tried to reassert what it called constitutional order. I often wondered if I'd get out alive. The waiting is over. To see how long the defenders can hold this town and if I can get my ass out at the end of it. I'd like to remind anybody who happens to be viewing this that this is a surrounded town. I managed to escape before the final assault and found myself on the Russian side of the lines. I was perfectly and horribly positioned to see people I had known stumble out of their burning town. Nearly 200 people were killed. It was the worst massacre of the Chechen War. I was haunted by the experience and vowed to return to find who among my many friends were alive or dead. In going back, I had to steel myself to face the physical and psychological scars carved by the knife of war. The aftermath is often more cruel than the moment. It had been almost 2 years since the massacre. The Russian soldiers may have gone, but their signature of destruction is everywhere to be seen. Samashki was used as a test firing range for artillery shells and vacuum bombs. It is a miracle that anyone survived the onslaught. I went to the graveyard to look for fallen friends. I was shocked to see how many fighters had died, their graves marked by flagpoles, lest future generations forget their sacrifice. That first night back, I attended a zikr, the ritual dance of remembrance for the dead. This was the first time I had seen the village elders and youth perform it together. During the war, the elders tried to surrender Samashki to the Russians, while the youth wanted to fight on. Now the war is over, and with no outside aid or international assistance, unity is required to rebuild. Shattered homes have become quarries, and bricks salvaged from the rubble, the building blocks of the future. Strangely, many people were surprised to find me alive.
Вы тут все говорили, что да, вот Томаса поймали, короче, расстреляли там, да, вот. Значит, жить долго будешь.
Переключен, да? Ну вы же почти 2 года здесь вот с нами, здесь находитесь. Я думал, вы потерялись.
It was almost as if I were a prodigal son returned. I found children back in school using old Russian textbooks.
Весь город был в руках большевиков.
Judging by their art, the children have been through hell. There were other changes too. This woman had broken the new law that prohibits trafficking alcohol. Theoretically, she could have been flogged, but instead only lost some 50 bottles. Islam may have come to Samashki, but the town is not completely dry. At a wedding reception that same evening, vodka flowed freely. I could scarcely believe my eyes and ears. Old friends were coming out of the woodwork to say hello, people dancing, people smiling and laughing. Samashki, a town synonymous with destruction and sorrow, seemed to have come back to life. The only thing to do was join in and celebrate. But something nagged me. I had still not learned of the fate of the Samashki commander, Hussein. He had sheltered me during the darkest days of the siege and even made my escape possible. You might say I owe him my life. I went to his house and found his father and brother hard at work loading potatoes. To my delight and relief, they told me Hussein had survived the assault, but was at present out of town.
last time I was here, I helped him pull a rocket warhead out of the ground and push it up a truck. I may as well do the potatoes now.
But my mood changed abruptly when they told me Hussein could not return. The village elders had branded him a traitor and said he had been working for the Russians all along.
Старики с деревни, старики приходили домой, говорили, чтобы он уезжал, как будто это он здесь войну сделал в Самашках. Он-то не хотел уезжать. Я знаю, как он уезжал, как он не хотел уезжать. Я никогда не поверю, чтобы брат мой старший нацию свою, что он предал.
I was staggered. The man I had seen mount devastating raids in Russian armor accused of collaboration with the enemy? I had to learn the truth. When Hussein left Chechnya, he traveled 3,000 miles east to the village of Nadezhdovka in Kazakhstan. I went there to find him. Ironically, this area is where Stalin had banished the Chechens in 1944, unjustly accusing them of collaboration with the Nazi enemy. I found Hussein on a broken-down collective farm.
Это когда-то было хорошее место, Томас.
Прекрасное место.
Очень хорошее место было. О, там была столовая, там чисто.
Hussein knew about the charge of collaboration. He dismissed it as disinformation spread by the elders. He said they were cowards who had forced him to abandon the people he had vowed to defend.
Мы, когда на поезд я вышел.
But he saved his real rage for the Russians. Under failing lights, he told me how drunken soldiers had attacked Samashki to the music of Shostakovich.
Вот эта музыка была, включенная. Полную мощность. Под эту музыку это село убивает. Это не людей убивает, село убивает. Первый раз я видел, как убивает село.
Hussein is now plotting his revenge against the Russians who murdered his people to music and the Chechens who tarnished his name. He showed me his arsenal, including a heavy machine gun customized for mobile use. His son Ruslan has become an expert marksman with the weapon and ready to avenge his father's honor.
Немножко готовится туда. Вот это все не кончилось еще. Так. Это только передышка, перерыв.
Hussein is going back to Samashki, and he is not going alone. During our last evening together, I was reacquainted with a number of men I had met before, hardcore veterans of the Samashki front. All had been branded with the same charge of collaboration. It was all too depressing. Betrayal. But who was the betrayer and who was betrayed in this case? Samashki or Hussein? His rejection by his own people had turned into a bitter rage. The invisible scars in his soul still bleeding. As I left him, I had to wonder and worry about the process of reconciliation and reconstruction in Samashki, and indeed, in Chechnya as a whole. The war is not over. Perhaps it has just begun.
I'll just sum up some notes here, and then those who have to leave, and then we can stay over and your questions. What happened? Hussein went back to, war began again in 1999. Hussein went back, then once again was self-exiled, managed to get
back in contact with me about a year or so ago, I said that this book was 700 days late coming in. Basically, it was because I'd been commissioned to write a Balkan Ghosts about the Caucasus, one chapter Azerbaijan, one chapter Ossetia, one chapter Dagestan, and I just couldn't do it, mainly because I was obsessed with what was happening there. When I realized, or when I found that Hussein was still alive, that was the moment that I realized that I had to write this book and not the book I'd been contracted to do, and that's why it was 700 days late. The one last little reading, just to anticipate a question, which is, what about that putative connection between Al-Qaeda, the Islamic fundamentalists, and the Chechens? I just want to get this one in here before we have to close the show. Where does it go to now? Come on. When the war began again in '99, I decided to once again illegally return, and was making an effort to go in from extreme northern Georgia over the mountains. And my way in was going to be via a two-car caravan of two white Mitsubishis that were under the control of a friend of mine, Tom Dibb, of the Halo Trust demining organization. They work from everywhere from Cambodia to Afghanistan, and wherever there are mines, these guys, most of them former sappers in the British military, go in and help demine in order so that turf can come back into use. Extraordinary organization and extraordinarily brave guys. Anyway, so there I am, and it's October 10th, because October 11th is my birthday, and I intended to spend it in Samashki. So I remember this quite distinctly. Remember, as I read through this, October 1999. Tom Dibb. We waited and waited. Then at dusk I heard the sound of distant motors, and then saw two sets of headlights making their way down the hairpin turns above Shatili, coming from the south. Soon two white Mitsubishi Land Cruisers pulled up to the security bar. It was Tom Dibb and another Brit from the Halo Trust, traveling with an escort of 4 or 5 Chechen toughs. My ticket out, meaning my transport back into Chechnya at war. But it did not look good. The weighted pole barrier gate called the Schlagbaum remained in place, and the Georgian guards stood their ground, refusing to let the Chechen convoy pass. I think it is because the Georgian commander knows you are media, said Tom. Act like you are leaving and then double back. We will cross at first light. After a truly miserable night spent in a filthy, wood smoke-filled cabin, I was back at the post early the next morning, but the vehicles were already gone. They went back to Tbilisi, said the commander. But on the far side of the Schlagbaum, there were fresh car tracks leading down over very rough ground to the rock-strewn, boiling white stream bed. Did they emerge on the other side and then disappear into Chechnya? It was almost impossible to tell. Well, not quite. In the wake of the September 11th attacks and war with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, the New York Times ran the following front-page article on December 9th, 2001, by reporter Michael Wines. It was entitled, War on Terror Casts Chechen Conflict in New Light. Dateline, Urus-Martan, Russia. The only road from Georgia into Chechnya worms northward from the Russian border across
rebels in Chechnya, and Mr. It come to Itum, a village wedged 7,000 peaks, to move relatives out of guerrilla territory that was certain to become a battle zone. He succeeded, but in unexpected fashion. For instead of the usual sputtering Lada automobile, there appeared on that hopelessly remote dirt path 2 brawny Mitsubishi 4-wheel drive vehicles driven not by Chechens but by foreigners. In my car there were 2 Brits and an Arab, Mr. Itzlayev said in a recent interview. I asked them why they came here. They said they were coming to help the Chechens. In fact,
The three were coming to join a group of militant Muslims that had established a paramilitary beachhead inside Chechnya. As in Afghanistan, some were outsiders and members of the strict Wahhabi branch of Islam. Their trademarks, as in Afghanistan, were money, fancy sport utility vehicles, and a taste for the best weaponry. Stories like Itzlayev's, Russian officials argue, bolster what the Kremlin has been saying all along, that its 2-year-old war in Chechnya is a battle against international terrorism, not a brutal suppression of domestic separatists. It is also the sort of story that Americans and other Westerners shrugged off until the attacks of September 11th forced a reassessment of the spread of terrorism, etc., etc. I do not know about the Arab, but I can state with almost total certainty that the two Brits referred to were Tom Dibb and his companion from the Halo Trust demining organization, a small fact lost in the fight to make the connecting link between Osama bin Laden and Chechnya. On that little note, I will throw this thing over to your questions, comments, and catcalls for those of you who don't have to book and run at exactly 1 o'clock. Thank you very much for having me here.
Maybe we need about 5 or 10 minutes to do a few questions for those who have to stay. Doors open.
You want to call on?
You can call them.
Okay. Sir.
In 1944, when the Chechens were sent out, were large numbers of Russians resettled in, so as the Chechens came back in 56 and thereafter, were there large numbers of Russians there, or what was the demographics and what are they today?
There was an effort to resettle the disintegrated Chechen Ingush Autonomous Republic. Rather than saying Russians, I would say Soviets. It was a policy of the center, natural or cynical, wherever there was any sort of disaster and a drop in population, not just in Chechnya, but also in, for example, Georgia, where the so-called Ahiska Turks were also sent into Central Asian exile. Their places of residence in western Georgia, along mainly the Turkish frontier, were filled largely by Armenians and others. In the case of Chechnya, it was industrial workers, if you want to call them Russians, Ukrainians. You can put your phone back on now, yes. Russians, Ukrainians, Jews, Armenians, Soviets, and mainly industrial workers. So when the Chechens came back, were their houses and farms occupied by other people? Yes. And aside from one obscure reference about a 3-day riot in Grozny in 1957 or 1958, where the center, Khrushchev, Kremlin, sent in national forces or Soviet forces to put down this series of rioting by the Russians or the Soviets, the immigrant population who were resisting the Chechens coming back into the thing. We don't have any trace of the roots back in, how the situation was settled at all. The one thing I would note there, and this is where the Soviet Union remains such a fascinating place to study, despite the exile, despite the trauma associated with 1944, etc., and the return, in 1957, the Chechens, who were largely an agrarian people and very, very bad Soviets, they didn't join the party, they didn't become the industrial proletariat. Suddenly, you end up with the Chechens becoming overachievers, using the Soviet system, schooling, this, that, and the other thing, to achieve very, very high ranks of education across the board. After Jews and Russians themselves, Valery Tishkov, in his fantastic book called Ethnicity and Nationalism in the Former Soviet Union, subtitle The Mind Aflame, basically shows, using education ministry statistics, how the Chechens achieved the highest rate of secondary school education of all, aside from Russians and Jews, within the entire Soviet Union, going from basically zero, where there were 5 high school graduates in 1933 or 1944, from 57 to the last census in 1989, it just rockets like this. And so basically what we have is a bunch of arguably overeducated
farmers with a historical memory that they've decided to act on. We end up with individuals like Johar Dudayev, who was the first Chechen leader of Chechnya in history, who some say that he disguised his ethnic identity initially, but the jury's out on that, joins the Soviet military and rises to the ranks of becoming a SAC general in the Soviet Air Force, basically Strategic Air Command. A Chechen in charge of one of the wings that was supposed to participate in World War III, should it ever break out. We have Ruslan Khazbalatov, who joins the Communist Party, comes up through the ranks and becomes Boris Yeltsin's right-hand man, and even makes the break with the Communist Party when Yeltsin does so famously in 1990, and becomes the Speaker of Parliament of the entire Russian Federation until Yeltsin turned on him and blasted him and Rutskoy out of the Russian White House or Parliament in 1993, which is when Rory Peck was killed. So the Chechens become these very, very good Soviets in a very paradoxical manner from 1957 on. Yes. Let's go here, and then I'll go back over there. Sir.
It's clear that the situation of the Chechens was just absolutely during the first. I don't know any Russians who would disagree with your assessment of the first Chechen conflict, that it was massacre by the Russians. It was a terrible situation. But then when Lebed basically gave them their freedom in 1996, why did they throw that away with that rampage of killing and kidnapping that you alluded to? I mean, these people weren't totally stupid, but their actions just remind you of Barbara Tuchman's Praise of Folly, the March of Folly. How can you? And then and you didn't mention their invasion of Dagestan, which was the straw that broke the camel's back, and at least ostensibly from the Russian point of view. Plus the blowing up of the apartment houses in Moscow, which is not completely solved, but I don't know any Russians that believe there was anybody else than Chechens that did it. Help me understand the total irrationality of the Chechens in throwing away their opportunity that Lebed gave them.
There are many explanations or comments that I can make to your question. I don't know if I will be able to give you a composite answer. First of all, the so-called Khasavyurt Accords, negotiated by General Maskhadov, the chief of staff of Johar Dudayev, and then elected president after that, after Dudayev's assassination in 1996. Chechen rebels surround Grozny, basically force the Russian military to negotiate, and the negotiator selected for this is General Alexander Lebed, who was killed in a helicopter crash last year. I've never heard that this was a suspicious helicopter accident. But he certainly was a rival of Yeltsin's, and one of the reasons he was selected to conduct the negotiations was it was such an unsavory task. Lebed basically put together a ceasefire arrangement that left Chechnya in limbo for 5 years, that while it had de facto achieved some manner of independence, the de jure aspect of the thing had been left afloat for 5 years. Nobody that I know was under any illusions about the desire of the Russian military to exact revenge for their humiliations and the Khasavyurt Accords. And Lebed's star took a big dive for having been involved in that process. So, and we'll get back to the apartment buildings and things like this. There's no question, however, that the Chechens really blew their one opportunity to achieve, if not even international recognition, at least international sympathy. They went from being noble warriors fighting on sacred ground against hopeless odds to being regarded as a nation of murderers, kidnappers, etc. To what extent the government of Maskhadov was involved in the various kidnappings, etc., and atrocities in Chechnya remains an uneasy question. Of course, the Chechens in the government of that time deny all roles in the kidnappings, killings, etc., and basically blame it on outside forces, sending in paid mercenaries, Chechen collaborators with the Russians and others to instigate these various nefarious and foul deeds to blacken the name of Chechnya in the world community. And if that was the policy, well, it was very, very effective. It seems to me that it's not going to be a black and white sort of thing, because there is this tradition of kidnapping, et cetera, and certainly in the blighted ground of Chechnya, collecting ransom from international aid workers, visiting journalists, et cetera, was, quite frankly, good business. I have a friend who was the head of the Chechen Solidarity Committee in Istanbul, who was kidnapped and spent 8 months, as he described it to me later, studying the behavior of ants as he was put in one cellar after a cave after another cellar. And his analysis of the thing is really, really heartbreaking, that he was sure that his release had been negotiated. They went into Grozny. He was still under captivity. The negotiations broke back down. They were brought back to a cave, thrown back in the thing, and he was sure that he was going to be killed as a result. And he began to cry. And one of his guards, kidnapping guards, said, "Oh, don't worry, you'll be released at 11 o'clock tonight." And my friend Fazil said, "What?" He said, "Just don't worry." And indeed, at 11:15, suddenly the kidnappers disappeared, and at exactly 11 o'clock, the liberators burst in, and he was freed, leaving Fazil with the distinct idea that the kidnappers and the liberators were cut from the same cloth, and he returned to Turkey. He had been one of the most firebrand nationalists among the diaspora Chechens in Turkey that I knew. And he said, "I threw myself down on the tarmac of Ataturk International Airport in Istanbul, kissed the dirty tarmac, and have declared myself to be a Turk, and I never want to see that place ever again." Sad. Really, really sad. Now, on to the, the resumption of hostilities, etc. Was it an invasion of Dagestan? That's the Russian perspective. From the Chechen perspective, they were either Shamil Basayev and his Islamic warriors. This was the Islamic wing of the resistance. Had been called to the assistance of several Dagestani communities of a Islamic flavor that were under assault. And so, rather than it being a invasion, it was actually an attempt to help. Others even say that Basayev did not walk into a trap, but was cogently aware that the Russians, under their new leader Putin, was planning something, and basically the Dagestani excursion just was designed to buy valuable time so they could stock up weapons and munitions and food items in caves in the Caucasus Mountains. What is the real answer? I don't know. In terms of the apartment bombings, those of you who don't know, this is one of the most horrible acts of this entire horrible period. One fine day in Moscow, in either August or September 1999, suddenly 3 apartment buildings, 10 stories apiece, something like that, 8 stories high, in a working class district of Moscow, were imploded from inside. 300 dead. The Russian media immediately said, "Chechens, Chechen terrorists," and it certainly was convenient for the Russian authorities to have this act of terror on their hands to stoke up enough patriotism among Russians to rekindle the war that had ground to a halt in 1996. That case has been explored by Boris Baranovsky and others, that various individuals have fingered the FSB, or renamed KGB, as being the institution that created this not so much diversion as casus belli for the
local police. The local police came over and found what they, after analysis, bags of sugar that had been made in a sugar factory that nobody had ever heard of in the Russian Federation, that had been laced with very, very high explosives, and that there were timers on top of these sugar bags. So it looked as if that somebody was at work there, whether it was Chechens or FSB or whomever, attempting to blow up yet another apartment building in this string of terror.
Well, Moscow was alerted to this, and Moscow sent down their experts, the FSB. They grabbed the bags of sugar, or the bags of explosive, brought them back to Moscow for additional analysis, and then after 3 days announced that it had all been an elaborate hoax designed to check local vigilance for terroristic attacks. Now, this didn't read very well with all of the invalids and others who had been forced to spend the night in the streets after having evacuating the apartment building. But even this aspect of the case has now been swept under the carpet, and all allusions to this in the Russian court system, etc., have now been put on ice. Who was ultimately responsible for these various acts and attempted acts of terror in Russia, I don't know. My sense is that this is not the Chechen style of doing acts of terror or acts of war. And although I cannot prove it, I lean toward the conspiracy theory on this, that it was just a very convenient and very nefarious and nasty means of restoking the coals of war.
Was there one more question?
Oh, well, the young lady gets one for her as well. Yes, sir.
In the video you talked about Hussein planning a rebellion. I was just wondering on what in what capacity, on what scale is he doing that, and will that be just against the Russians or against the people in Samashki as well?
Well, what he said at the time was that it wasn't a rebellion, but basically acts of revenge. I don't know his story in round 2 of the war, aside from that he went, fought, came back utterly twisted, and is now in Kazakhstan again. I have to go out and deliver this book to him. It's a solemn vow of mine, and then I'll get those details. But it was his hatred was going in 2 directions. One was against those Chechens who had tarnished his name, and the other was against the Russians who had slaughtered his people to the music of Shostakovich. Ma'am, here comes the microphone.
Thanks. I was just wondering, what's the deal about the Russians and the Chechens? Is it a religious thing, or is it just a minority thing? Why did they deport them, and then the reasons for the 2 Chechen conflicts and stuff?
I thought I just gave a lecture on that subject. Where does religion start and ethnicity, or stop and ethnicity begin? What is ethnicity? What is a nation? And how does religion impact on various communities? I would submit to you, and I thought I was leading you in this direction, but then again I didn't have 2 hours to go through the entire ethno-national development of the Soviet space and the post-Soviet space, but it was a particular thing. Ethnicity as such was encouraged, even while religion as such was discouraged. So that divisions were cemented in stone in the Soviet space. Okay? Is there a distinction between a Russian and a Chechen? Yes, it's linguistic, it's of memory, both historical memory is more recent memory, and it is also of religion. Russians are now embracing the Orthodox Church, which they were disallowed to do during the Soviet period. Chechens are not only restoking their version of Islam, but also importing other versions of Islam from the Middle East, notably the Wahhabi sect of Saudi Arabia. And when asked why that is, one reason is that in their hour of need, the only people who seem to be giving the Chechens aid and assistance, whether cash or men or ideology, were these rabid Muslim essentialists from Saudi Arabia and Afghanistan. Notably, during that brief period of quasi-independence, if not de facto, if not de jure, Chechnya was only recognized by one other state in the world. And with friends like them, you don't really need enemies. This would be, of course, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. A last question, or shall we call it to an end? We got one.
This is not related to Chechnya specifically. It's just about Circassians in specific.
Sure.
Why do you personally, your personal view on why did they around the Black Sea down to the Middle East? Why do you think? What was the reason behind that? What do you think?
There's a book that I was referring to one of your professors earlier today, which is called Death in Exile by Justin McCartney. McCartney, yeah. And in one of it's basically about the slow retraction of the Ottoman Empire from the Balkans, from the Caucasus, and elsewhere, and what happened to these Ottoman Muslims, who then eventually became Turks in the Republic of Turkey under Ataturk. But the waves of forced migration from the Balkans, from the Caucasus, from the Middle East, and elsewhere. The case of the Caucasus and the Black Sea, and in the Circassians to which you refer, is, or as Professor McCartney points out, he would maintain that this is the first case of ethnic cleansing in the modern world.